galaxy burns. Yet still we stand, the last bulwark against the terror. And while we draw breath, we will fight. For in this new dark age, there is only war.
If you don't know what that was all about already, that video is the new trailer for the next edition of Warhammer 40,000, the popular tabletop wargame owned by British company Games Workshop. A game set 40,000 years in the future, where mankind has entered a new dark age, and is under attack by aliens, demons, and the 8-foot-tall super soldiers who worship them. But it's okay, because mankind has their own 8-foot-tall super soldiers to fight right back. Now, I say game, but at this point it's really a whole lot more than that. Since we first got introduced to Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader in 1987, Warhammer 40,000 has been able to grow beyond just its tabletop roots. Modern Warhammer 40,000, or just Warhammer 40k, or even 40k, enjoys a large multimedia appeal. Black Library, a publishing company owned by Games Workshop, pumps out 40k books like there's no tomorrow. The Horus Heresy series, which is based on the prequel creation war of the setting, has 56 books alone! And they're actually kinda good! There are some bangers in there, man! There is also just bunches of beloved video games based on Warhammer 40k, like Dawn of War 1 and Dawn of War 2. Not you, Dawn of War 3. Get out of here! Get out of here! Space Marine, and the recent Mechanicus game, which is getting a nice little console release. Or it's already gotten a console release. I don't know. Time is hard. I've kind of lost track of all of it here in quarantine. Also, I recently was replaying Dawn of War 1 to get some B-roll for the original version of this video I made. And boy, the nostalgia was real. Playing Necrons as a 5th grader at my buddy's house was the first I'd ever heard of the setting. So you can imagine my joy as a child when I learned I could make my parents buy me Necrons for real. Games Workshop also announced that Warhammer 40,000 is getting a few new official animation series, like Angels of Death and Hammer and Bolter. And they also nabbed the Man in the High Castle director for a TV series about Warhammer 40,000 that'll come out eventually? Which, these series already have high bars set for them by the incredible fan animations that have already been made, like Hell's Reach and Astartes, and If the Emperor Had a Text-to-Speech Device, which isn't as visually impressive as the other two, but its comedic timing is just too perfect to ignore. But yeah, the war game is also pretty popular and neat and stuff right now too. It's getting a new edition to follow up the game's most popular edition ever, and Games Workshop is doing well enough as a company that even in the middle of the end of the world, it was able to pay back the money given to it by British stimulus funds. And I will admit, I may have contributed a significant amount of my own money to making sure that Games Workshop is doing well in the middle of a pandemic. Look, man, Engine War, Robo-Cowboys. Robot cowboys riding around, shooting bad guys like it's Tombstone with cyborgs. I don't know what you want from me. I don't know what you want from me or my spending habits. I'm gonna buy the Robo-Cowboys. You can't stop me. Now with that success, Warhammer 40,000 gets to make its way more into mainstream media culture, which further opens up the setting for critical examination. My first attempt at doing that tried to take the entire setting and analyze its popularity and appeal based on the lore and all of that stuff, and by the end I just kinda made a bloated monster of a script. So, with that in mind, I'll say this. If you're unaware of what the setting of Warhammer 40,000 is, I would really recommend pausing this and doing some quick reading, or watch some YouTube channels about it. Oculus Imperia and Luton09 are swell dudes who will talk about the extensive background of the setting. But if I start talking about the background, it's gonna double the length of this video. And while I tried doing that in the original version of the script and making it as short and succinct and punchy as possible, talking about all that really ground the video to a halt. So, if you're curious about the themes of this video and don't already know about it, go out, get acquainted with Warhammer 40,000, and come back when you're ready so we can really deep dive into this topic. So, I want to laser focus things this time around. This time, I'm going to talk about a deep theme in the fictional universe, also known as the fluff or lore, of Warhammer 40,000. The conversation around the lore of Warhammer 40k is an interesting beast, because the extreme popularity of Warhammer 40k, I would argue, comes largely from its very unique established setting. And this setting tends to be really interesting in just the best ways, but in the same stroke, it can be understandably problematic. I have yet to find another fictional universe so proudly boasts the fact that its moral compass is absolutely horribly skewed as much as Warhammer 40,000 does. Ask any fan who the good guy is in Warhammer 40k, and I promise you, they're going to say, well, there aren't really any good guys in the setting. Everyone is a bad guy on some level. Then you need to double down on it and ask them, well, that sounds kinda awful. Having no good guys sucks. Why should I like this thing? At that point, you can sit back, relax, and watch a human being backpedal their argument like they're trying to win the Tour de France in reverse. And while they're trying to justify the morality of the fictional setting of Warhammer 40,000, you're going to hear one word over and over and over again. It is a word that, boy, do I hate. I just feel so stupid every time I say it. It is a real dumb word, but it is a core to the identity of Warhammer 40,000, so I gotta say it, and we're gonna talk about it today. Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about Warhammer, Grimdark, and you. Ugh, God, that word is so bad, it's just so edgy. So, Grimdark. I'm sure this isn't the first time you've heard the word. With the recent release of Naughty Dog's The Last of Us 2, and the success of HBO's Game of Thrones, before the series promptly nuked that success from orbit with one of the worst final seasons of all time, boy, R.I.P. in pieces the legacy of that show, huh? Grimdark, as an adjective, is something that is thrown around a lot. For its part, Warhammer 40,000 gets the distinction of being the originator for the term Grimdark. The origins of Grimdark as a phrase comes from Warhammer 40,000's very famous tagline, which let me put on my deepest, most gravelly voice for. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Did I do good there? Was I a good Batman? I think I nailed it. So, that grim darkness bit eventually became the phrase Grimdark. So, while at first Grimdark was a word exclusively used to make fun of this tagline, because let's call a spade, in the grim darkness of the far future there is only war, is big edgelord energy. It got thrown around enough that it eventually became an adjective of its own. Here's a few definitions for Grimdark. From Oxford: a genre of fiction, especially fantasy fiction, characterized by disturbing, violent, or bleak subject matter and a dystopian setting. Collins English Dictionary: a genre of fantasy fiction that portrays amoral or morally ambiguous characters engaged in violent struggles and dystopian environments. Lastly, Urban Dictionary. 1. An adjective taken from the root words of grim and darkness, both of which are featured in the tagline for Warhammer 40,000. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. It is usually used to describe a setting that would equal poor living conditions and life expectancies for those actually living in it. Example: man at 4chan, they have this totally grim dark picture of Inspector Gadget. By the way, that picture exists. I had to look at it, and now so do you. We can gather a few things from these definitions. Grimdark is a way to define a setting that is bleak, violent, often dystopian and morally ambiguous at best. I'll also take a minute to note here that Grimdark isn't really even a genre. It's better defined as a collection of tropes, themes, and tone that can all be used to define a story as grimdark. So this really leaves quite a large interpretation of what something that is grimdark even is. But for now, let's just say it is any thematically bleak fictional story that can be easily described by the definitions above. These kind of grimdark settings have been enjoying a lot of modern popularity. Some of the biggest shows of recent memory, Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead immediately come to mind, have fallen in this scope of being defined by their nearly oppressive sense of hopelessness and pervasive moral ambiguity. The extremely popular anime and manga series Attack on Titan similarly created an explosion of popular grimdark stories in the mainstream of anime and manga. The very first The Last of Us game by Naughty Dog, as well as its sequel, sold like hotcakes and proved that there was a massive market for dark, bleak, and serious stories in video gaming. The huge appeal of grimdark stories is nothing new, of course. Even if Warhammer 40,000 created the term, dystopian books like George Orwell's 1984 were doing what could be defined as grimdark long before the existence of Warhammer 40,000, and there have always been successful pieces of media that could be described as grimdark. What has really changed about grimdark stuff now is just how prevalent it is. It feels like everywhere I look, someone is trying to reach out and cash in on the grimdark train. Streaming services and network TV executives are greenlighting grimdark new stuff left and right. Examples include the Witcher series on Netflix, TNT is doing that Snowpiercer remake, which is that any good? And Amazon's current adaptation of the comic series, The Boys. What's really wild to see is other series hop on the grimdark train to try and chase that sweet, sweet grimdark money when they weren't really grimdark in the first place, just taking this wild left turn into grimdark. Star Trek Discovery and Picard took real dark tones compared to their older series, and now both are rated TVMA, which, by no means am I a huge expert on Star Trek, but TVMA Star Trek as a concept is just wild. But is all this new grimdark media a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I think at the end of the day, it's a thing. And I'm kind of leaning towards the bad thing, the more stuff I see chase the dragon to Game of Thrones money. Dragon pun. On the one hand, when I first asked some friends about it, they told me that the darker stories allow for more complicated characters, forced into complicated situations, which is great for creating drama. On the other hand, grimdark media can really easily A, take itself with a sort of extreme, deadly seriousness that is no fun to indulge in, which destroys any satire found in the setting, more on that later, and B, slip into something I like to call misery porn. Before we talk too much about misery porn, let's ask why we like dark stories in the first place. I believe it can be boiled down to a very simple concept I call the tragedy versus triumph loop. In any story, bad things will happen and antagonists will arise. These antagonists will do things to the characters that inflict some sort of tragedy. Often this puts us in the part of the hero's journey called the abyss. Now, in most stories, the heroes will escape this abyss and overcome the forces that hurt them, and the antagonists will get what they deserve, and oftentimes characters defeat their own lingering trauma inflicted on them by the antagonists in the process. Being able to overcome the bad things that happen to us in life is one of the most relatable things people find in any story. Grimdark stories are often built to where we spend most of our time in that abyss, and the suffering and awfulness of the setting makes it all the better when we get that sweet triumph. It also leads to complex and morally gray characters who may do awful things to reach their goals because the story and world they live in is just so oppressive and violent. And then it is up to us, the audience, to decide whether their actions are justified or not. The story is bleak, but that bleakness makes the actions its heroes take to succeed more interesting. As a good friend put it, he likes it when stories portray imperfect people trying to figure out their life in the terrible world around them. Misery porn, as I define it, is when a piece of media has decided that the main appeal of that story is to make the characters within it suffer as horribly as possible, inflicting tragedy after tragedy for that sweet, sweet, big triumph payoff at the end. While there is a certain logic to this, the audience often needs some breathing room when really horrible things occur in the story in order to recover. After all, while it is immensely satisfying to see a big triumph after lots of tragedy, it is also emotionally draining to keep hurting the characters. Do it too much, and you risk losing your audience completely when they can't stomach it anymore, or they just become kinda numb to the suffering. In either way, the story can seem to turn into suffering for suffering's sake. And man, that sucks to watch. Unless you're a sociopath, watching someone suffer sucks. And there are points in any good story of all genres where bad things happen to good characters and they suffer in some way. But if it happens too much, what you thought was going to be a grimdark story turns into an edgy, unenjoyable mess. So, why this big tangent about defining grimdark and grimdark media and why it's good and why it's bad and how it slides into misery porn just a little too much? Because no setting or IP hangs onto being grimdark with both hands harder than Warhammer 40,000. Let's rewind a bit. We already talked about how no one is the good guy in Warhammer 40,000. The setting is defined by its grim darkness, a distant future where there is no peace amongst the stars. War is all the galaxy truly knows, and your government is, at best, a bloated fascist evil empire that cares very little about your life. At worst, well, demons, baby! There's no breaking this cycle. No one man could ever save mankind. It is simply too far gone now. All it can do at this point is violently thrash and kick against the forces at the gates until one day it is inevitably overwhelmed in a sea of violence and hate. That sounds a hell of a lot like misery porn to me. And a lot of fans eagerly cling to this ultra dystopian, awful version of the galaxy because they believe that's the selling point of Warhammer 40,000. They bend over backwards to justify and even glorify the awful beliefs that the characters in Warhammer 40,000 have. They think that any advancement in the plot that goes against the idea of no hope, only slow doom, is bad. That everything must be violent, gritty, awful, and hopeless literally all the time. Did someone smile on that planet? Oh, buddy. Windmill slam the exterminatus button, cause we don't do smiling here. But Dan, grimdark is violent and oppressive, and Warhammer 40,000 is the original grimdark setting. The fact that it is so awful, brutal, and backwards all the time is the appeal of Warhammer 40,000. Well, no. Let me explain. Firstly, I'm going to address that much of the setting of Warhammer 40,000 was originally intended as satire back in the 80s when it was made. That's not a very controversial statement. Everybody knows that the Imperium is a satire of fascism, right? Well, and this is where the setting becomes understandably problematic. Games Workshop left the satire of the Imperium in the dust long ago. In order to further develop the lore of the setting, Games Workshop abandoned a lot of the goofy aspects of the original Rogue Trader days into something more serious that could be better explored and expanded upon around the 3rd edition of Warhammer 40,000. And honestly, for the game to be as big as it is now, that was probably the right call to expand the universe it was set in. However, that means stuff that was once plain text satire, like the Imperium of Man's fascism, is now very much subtext satire at best. And subtext satire doesn't really work, especially not in 2020, good God. Whew. This leads to a whole lot of very problematic people being drawn to Warhammer 40,000 as an affirmation of their beliefs. Instead of seeing it as a satirization, it is. And anytime the setting goes through a cycle of tragedy and triumph where these bad guys succeed, even when that success is very morally gray, that triumph solidifies their bad beliefs. Remember, Poe's Law. Never forget Poe's Law. So, looking at Warhammer 40,000's brand of Grimdark, we can already attribute some of the over-the-top awful stuff to satire that doesn't land, compounded by people who then flock to what they believe justifies their worldview. I think at the end of the day, Games Workshop could use more stories where the stuff that's supposedly satirical, namely the Imperium of Man's fascism, is more obviously played for that satire. Point out the incompetence of Imperium Command, just how backwards their system is, and the belief that this is the only way is wrong. Like, very obviously point that out. But not too obviously, because if you lean too hard into satire, then people think you want to eat Irish babies a la A Modest Proposal. Man, satire is hard. Someone is always going to miss the point of it no matter what you do, huh? Yikes. Moving on from satire, let's go back and look at that triumph versus tragedy loop and how it pertains to Grimdark. See, when I was asking around as to what people find interesting about Grimdark's settings, and looking back on the Warhammer 40k stories I've enjoyed over the years, something became clear to me. Warhammer 40,000, in general, puts far more focus on the triumph from overcoming oppressive odds than it does the tragedy caused by those odds. Weird to say for a setting that does nothing but explain how tragic it is, but hear me out. Warhammer 40,000 has what could be called impossible odds stories in spades. These are action stories that are all about, well, overcoming impossible odds. Yes, the dangers stacked against the heroes of the stories of the 41st millennium are often insane. But if you were to go and read a book set in 40k, you'd probably find the main characters within them triumphing against those odds. And sometimes the way they do it is far more morally ambiguous than others. Inquisitor Eisenhorn, for example, is a lot more of a morally complicated character than someone like Colonel Commissar Gaunt or the average Space Marine captain. But honestly, most of the time characters succeed in the stories of Warhammer 40,000 through over-the-top heroics, even though the setting is so oppressive and grim all the time. Take the story of the World Engine. Oh, is that a giant Death Star filled with undead murder robots? And we can't get missiles through its shield? Welp, better load up the Space Marine boys, ram that Death Star, and bail out at the last second to fight our way to that power generator so we can turn off the shield just long enough for the fleet assembled over there to blow this whole thing up. That's an actual story, and it's an awesome story. But it's also not really that grimdark as we've defined it earlier. More campy pulpy action, really. Like, yeah, a giant Necron planet-destroying spaceship is over-the-top, oppressive, violent, and dystopian. And almost all the Space Marines of the Astral Knights chapter died in the process of bringing down those shields. But they won through heroic fighting and sacrifice, which is a theme that doesn't really fit most grimdark stories. And there are also some examples where things don't go as well before the final victory. The invasion of Ionden comes to mind, where the Eldar had to raise the entirety of their dead into wraith constructs in order to even possibly think of defeating the Tyranid invaders, which to them was tantamount to sacrilege. And then, only when the outcast Prince Uriel comes to the rescue wielding a spear that drains his own life force, do they finally push back the Tyranids off the craft world. The Eldar win, but it's at a terrible cost of both many of their peoples and the cultural legacy of Craftworld Ionden. And then sometimes in Warhammer 40,000 the bad guys win, like when Cadia is destroyed by Abaddon right before the heroes think they've won and pushed the Chaos Marines off the planet. And if you look at the Horus Heresy series, the entire 56-book saga is ultimately sort of a tragedy of the fall of Horus, and that doesn't have nearly as many tales of wild heroics. But rarely does a setting create stories where the characters within them go through personal trauma after trauma, We don't see characters like we do in Berserk, or The Handmaid's Tale, where atrocities seem to follow the characters like a lost puppy, and the brutality of the setting manifests in being personally antagonizing to the protagonists within them. Rather, Warhammer 40,000 tends to use the violent, dystopian, and oppressive background that it is set in to tell myriads of tales of varying tones, but usually with some level of heroic action flair, and the bad things that happen to the characters within them rarely feel like the story is out to get them. The tragedy versus triumph loop is still there, but the tragedy is more often the overwhelming terror of the setting they live in, rather than actions against the characters that are on a more personal and horrific level, like something out of most other Grimdark media. Warhammer 40,000 is not necessarily about how grimdark it is all the time, and how no one can succeed because of that fact. That more exists in the background. Warhammer 40,000 is more about how harrowing and cruel the galaxy is, and the actions people take to overcome those fearful odds to get what they want. And depending on who the story's main characters are, the way we get there will be different. For a story about Space Marines or Guardsmen, it may be about fighting to the last bullet and the last man to reach your goal and never giving up, even if that goal is to just see tomorrow. For a story about an Inquisitor, it may be about the morally difficult decisions you have to make in order to reach those goals. Do the ends justify the means? What do you have to do to keep the population of the Imperium safe? Even villains get to become more interesting in a setting like this, where often they too must overcome a cruel galaxy to reach their goals. Aaron Dembski-Bowden's The Black Legion series, as well as his Night Lord series, are about Chaos Space Marines that are good examples of this idea. We do get to see the goals that drive them, and how they may be more sympathetic than we thought at first, and how the challenges they face are just as impossible seeming as the Imperium they want to destroy. Like how the Black Legion's war against the Imperium, what they call the Long War, is driven by a burning need for vengeance against the Imperium they once fought for 10,000 years before, and if they don't keep those fires of revenge burning in their hearts, they can't ever possibly hope to win. Which still very much makes them the bad guys, and at the end of the day you read these books and remember, oh yeah, these are the bad guys. But it is very compelling to read about how Abaddon the Despoiler's conviction to this vengeance inspires those around him. Warhammer 40,000 is a setting with no real good guys. And yeah, that does suck, and while sometimes, it's really fun to be the bad guy. For most people to feel invested in a setting though, we need someone to root for. And the descriptions of how violent and oppressive the setting is makes it sound a whole lot more like misery porn rather than something more interesting. So with all of this grimdark, if somebody asks you why they should like Warhammer 40,000, what should you say? Say that Warhammer 40,000 is more than just about the grimdark themes of its setting, but about how because it is a setting that is unrelenting and unforgiving, it means that its character struggles to reach their goals are all the more interesting. Like my friend said earlier, it becomes an interesting setting where a whole lot of very flawed at best factions and organizations and people are trying to figure out how to survive in an extremely hostile galaxy. We can also point out that oftentimes its darkest elements are an extreme satire of real modern problems, and can see that ultimately while those elements of satire are very interesting, they probably need to be more pronounced to make their message clear. Say that despite how grimdark the setting is, it's still very careful with its tragedy versus triumph loop, and rarely slides into misery porn. And in fact, its heroics are usually way more prone to something you'd see in Lord of the Rings than in Game of Thrones. That it's never really about the tragedy happening to the characters within it nearly as much as it is about the characters overcoming the cruel, bloody universe that they live in. Warhammer 40,000, at the end of the day, is probably my favorite fictional setting. Yes, it is the original grimdark setting, but grimdark itself really isn't a definable subgenre, and most things that get lumped into grimdark nowadays share very little tonally with Warhammer 40,000. Modern grimdark tales spend a lot more time ruminating on the atrocities inflicted on their characters and really exploring how hopeless, violent places can drive characters within it, and that those characters can often become transformed into something far darker in their fight against it. That's a pretty good description for some 40k stuff, like the Eisenhorn series, which is probably why it's getting a show. But most of the time, Warhammer 40,000 ends up being the summer action blockbuster of grimdark media. From the Imperium of Man to the Chaos Space Marines, the setting demands they fight for what drives them. It can be galactic domination, or just seeing tomorrow. It's not the fact that Warhammer 40,000 is a dystopian future full of violence that's the reason Warhammer 40,000's brand of grimdark works. Rather, the words of Welsh poet Dylan Thomas best summarize the relationship between grimdark and Warhammer 40,000 in my opinion. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And with that, I have successfully backpedaled my entire way through the Tour de France to justify why that edgy old tagline, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war," actually works. Thank you for watching. Hey, thanks for watching my first video here on YouTube. It was a lot of fun putting this together. Doing something like this was something that I've really been thinking about and wanting to do for a very long time, and to be able to finally just have this out there it's pretty cool to finally have done it. If you really enjoyed the video, which I hope you did, you made it this far, go ahead and please hit that subscribe button and maybe even hit that little bell button to know when I put up new videos, because there's going to be new videos. I want to keep doing this. I have a lot to talk about, and not just about Warhammer 40,000, but a lot of other nerd stuff too. And I can't wait to see you there when those new videos are ready. These ending taglines are a little bit awkward to put together. Also, a reminder to go subscribe to Oculus Imperia and Luton's channels. They're great dudes. I follow them on Twitter, and they are just rays of positivity into the Warhammer hobby, which, by the way, follow me on Twitter. I'll put that in the description as well. I'm a pretty cool dude, if I do say so myself. Anyways, guys, I'll see you guys in the next one. Good night.